Were you successful? Let's try it together. And for that, I'll first of all create my expense filter.js file and my expense filter CSS file. And I did provide the content for these files to you. So here's the expense filter CSS content. And for expense filter.js, I also have this starting state with the markup and with the CSS file already imported. We can also add the React import if we want to, but this is not required technically, as you learned. So now we got a couple of tasks. Task number 1 is to listen to changes here. And that means that we want to react whenever a new option is chosen. So we want to listen to changes on this select element in the end, because it's this select which will emit a change event whenever the user clicks the dropdown and picks a new value. And thankfully, we can listen to changes just as we learned it for the other inputs. We can add the onChange prop. This is a built-in element, a built-in component, and it does support this onChange prop just as the input elements in our form did before. So here, for onChange, I want to do something. And the something which I want to do is I want to trigger a function. That's what you learned. That's what you typically do for these events. So we can define a function before we return, and we could name it filter change handler or just dropdown change handler, whatever you want. This is up to you. Now I will pass a pointer at this function to onChange here to make sure that it's this function which is triggered whenever a value is chosen. And as you learned, don't execute it here, just point at it. Now, just as for the inputs you saw before in earlier lectures, we will get an event object here, and we can retrieve the chosen value from that. We can, for the moment, console log this, for example, and simply output event target value. This works just as you saw it for the other input elements. Now with that, we have a first step. Now in the expenses component here, I will add a div and add my expense filter, my expenses filter component here, and make sure you also add an import to that component. And of course, that div should wrap the card as well, so that we have one root element and then filter side by side with that card. Actually, we can even move it into the card. That should look a bit nicer. Whoops, I mean like this. So expense filter inside of the card. If you had it next to it, that's also fine. It just looks nicer if it's inside the card. Now looks like I have a typo here. Yes, I'm looking for, I named it expenses filter here. So I will also name it expenses filter JS and expenses filter CSS so that the imports work again. And in expenses.js, I also want to import from expenses filter. With that, if I save that, it works again. Now here's my filter. And if I open the console now, we see that whenever I change the value, that picked value is logged to the console. So that's working. Now that's the first part of the assignment and already an achievement. But the next part is to forward that value, that picked value, to the expenses.js file. And then there we want to manage it as state. Now we learned that we can forward data from child to parent by using this event approach, so that we pass a function down to a component and that component then calls that function when something happens. So we want to pass a function to expenses filter so that this component calls that function whenever a new value is chosen. So in expenses.js, I will define the function which I want to pass down, and I'll name it filter change handler. And I expect to get the selected year as an argument here, like this. And then for the moment, I'll just log expenses.js to prove that it's this file which is logging, and log the selected year. And now it's a pointer at this function which we pass to expenses filter. So here we add a prop with a name of your choice since it's your component, But again, I'll follow the convention and start with on, and I'll then name it on change filter, something like this, and point at this filter change handler function. And now it's this prop which we can use in expenses filter. If we accept props here, then instead of console logging, we can call on change filter. So this function which we receive through that prop with that name, we can call it and forward event target value, which is that selected year, as we saw in the console here. So now that's forwarded to expenses.js. And hence, if we save this now and reload, we see that expenses.js is logging that picked year. And therefore now, last but not least, we want to save that in a state, because that was also part of the assignment. And therefore in expenses.js, I will import use state. And instead of logging this, I want to update my state. Therefore, first of all, we have to set up a state. As you learned, you do that directly in the component function. And then here, I will initialize this state with a value of, let's say, 2020 maybe, and then have my filtered year here and my set filtered year function. And whenever this filter change handler function executes, we can now set the filtered year to the selected year, which we receive as a parameter. And that's it for the moment. Now, however, there is one adjustment we can make, which I didn't mention before, and which is a bonus point you can score here. We can pass this filtered year back into the expenses filter to basically set up two-way binding and pass the currently selected year as a value into this dropdown. So that if we set an initial year of 2020 here in expenses, that is reflected in that dropdown. Because currently it's not. If I save everything, we see the default value is 2022. And that's not the default value I set up here in expenses. So to make sure that this is reflected, as a bonus, we can pass another prop here to expenses filter. Let's say selected. Again, it's your component, so the prop name is up to you. And pass the filtered year, so this selected state, as a value for this selected prop to expenses filter. And inside of expenses filter, we can then use this selected prop to set the value for this dropdown. And this works like on the other inputs. We can set the value prop here and set this to props selected. And if we do that, we now see if we reload, 2020 is the default year because this is being set, and we can still switch. So now we're again utilizing two-way binding here to also be able to control the default value here in the expenses component. And that's the assignment solved. That again practiced listening to events, passing data from child to parent, and working with state.